The trouble with this line of reasoning, which Marx took to pieces, is that, 1. A compound term used in a technical sense, but sometimes To my readers I would like to call readers' attention to certain features of a book that may, in many respects, surprise and disconcert them. 1. This short book is the first volume of a work that has to comprise 2 volumes. Volume 1 is about the reproduction of capitalist relations of production. Volume 2 will be about the class struggle in capitalist social formations. For reasons of theoretical and political urgency obvious to everyone, I have decided to publish the present volume, Volume 1, without delay. In a certain way, it forms a whole that can stand on its own, aside from the liminal chapter on philosophy. While the theoretical basis for this volume has not been improvised, I have had to write the 200 pages it contains very quickly so that the text could appear rapidly. I thought it might be useful to recall the basic principles of Marxist-Leninist theory concerning the nature of capitalist exploitation, repression and ideologization. Above all, it seemed to me imperative to show clearly what sort of system ensures the reproduction of the conditions of capitalist production being nothing but a means to the end of capitalist exploitation, since, under the capitalist regime, the production of consumer goods obeys the law of profit alone, and thus the law of exploitation. A full discussion would consider 1. The reproduction of the productive forces and 2. The reproduction of the relations of production. Since Marx discusses the reproduction of the productive forces at length in Capital Volume 1, the theory of wages, reproduction of labor power, and Capital Volume 2, the theory of the reproduction of the means of production, I have treated this question cursorily. On the other hand, I have discussed the reproduction of the relations of production at length. Marx has left us important pointers on this subject, but they are unsystematic. The system that ensures the reproduction of the relations of production is the system of state apparatuses, the repressive apparatus, and the ideological apparatuses. That explains the title of Volume 1, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production, Exploitation, Repression, Ideology. As the reader will see, I have taken the considerable risk of putting forward theses on these 2 points which, while they are in perfect conformity with the theory and practice of the Marxist-Leninist workers' movement, had not yet been stated in systematic theoretical form. Thus I have sketched a theory of what I call the ideological state apparatuses, and also of the functioning of ideology in general. Since the analyses in Volume 1 depend, in certain cases, on principles to be worked out in Volume 2, I ask readers to grant me a kind of theoretical and political credit. I shall try to honor the obligation thus incurred in Volume 2, in which I shall broach the problems of the class struggle in capitalist social formations. 2. The present volume, Volume 1, begins with a chapter that will seem surprising. It is about the nature of philosophy. It will seem the more surprising in that, after marking off the terrain with a few signposts, I leave the question of philosophy in abeyance and make a very long detour in order to discuss the question of the reproduction of the capitalist relations of production. Why have I begun with this first chapter on philosophy when I could simply have begun with Chapter 2, on the mode of production? I do so for reasons that are very important both theoretically and politically. They will appear at the end of Volume 2, when we will be in a position to answer the questions. What is Marxist-Leninist philosophy? In what does its originality consist? Why is it a revolutionary weapon? The present account of the reproduction of capitalist relations of production has not been placed under the aegis of the question of philosophy simply to facilitate the exposition. The fact is that we cannot say what Marxist-Leninist philosophy is without making the long detour through Volume 1, Reproduction of the Relations of Production, and Volume 2, The Class Struggle. But why foreground the question of Marxist-Leninist philosophy this way, as well as the logically prior question of philosophy without court? Volume 1, I have not chosen to proceed in this fashion because I am, academically speaking, a philosopher, that is, because I am a specialist eager to talk about a subject I know a little about, or because I want to praise my wares. I have done so for political and theoretical reasons, as a communist. Here are those reasons, in brief. Everything that falls within the purview of the science founded by Marx, especially, in this volume, the theory of the reproduction of the relations of production, depends on a revolutionary science that Marx was only able to found on the basis of what the Marxist tradition calls the philosophy of dialectical materialism very precisely, as we shall point out and also prove, on the basis of a proletarian class position in philosophy. It is, consequently, impossible then, admirably understood and showed this, to grasp or, a fortiori, expound and develop Marxist theory, even on a single, limited point, without adopting proletarian class positions in the realm of theory. The characteristic task of each and every philosophy is to represent, in theory, a given class position. The characteristic task of Marxist philosophy is to represent, in theory, the proletarian class position. Whence the primordial importance, for every exposition and every development of Marxist theory, of dialectical materialist philosophy, that is, the proletarian class viewpoint in philosophy. We shall show in Volume 2 that the role of Marxist-Leninist philosophy is not only vital for the development of Marxist science and the concrete analysis of concrete situations, Lenin, which alone makes Marxist science possible, but that it is also vital for the political practice of the class struggle. If this is so, it is no wonder that our first volume begins by asking what is philosophy. Or that our second volume should culminate in a definition of the revolutionary nature of the Marxist-Leninist conception of philosophy and its role in scientific and political practice. When we have reached that point, we will understand why and how philosophy is, in a concrete sense, a revolutionary weapon. While my communist comrades, at least, will be willing to grant me, at the outset, what I have just said about the importance of Marxist-Leninist philosophy in scientific practice, above all in the theory of history founded by Marx, but in the other sciences as well, and also in the communist practice of the class struggle, an objection can nevertheless be raised against it, even from a Marxist standpoint. It may be objected that others have long since said and written what needs to be said about Marxist-Leninist philosophy, called, in the classical tradition, dialectical materialism. For everyone knows that there are many celebrated texts on the philosophy founded by Marx and his successors. For example, the theses on Feuerbach and the afterword to the second German edition of Capital. For example, Engels, Anti-Düring and Ludwig Feuerbach. For example, Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism and Philosophical Notebooks. For example, Stalin's essay Dialectical and Historical Materialism. For example, Mao's On Practice and On Contradiction 1937, and Where Do Correct Ideas Come From? 1. Why, under these circumstances, should we raise the question of Marxist-Leninist philosophy again? 1. Let us say, in order to take stock of things, but also in order to spell out certain crucially important points, while throwing the political and theoretical character of our class practice and philosophy into sharper relief. 2. We cannot, however, stick to this still speculative expository standpoint. It is not just a question of making the reader see and understand the specificity and novelty of our philosophy. It will also be a question, from now on, of putting that philosophy to work in a practical way, in short, of putting it to work on scientific problems. It will appear in short order, beginning with our simple analysis of the unity comprised by a mode of production, the unity between productive forces/relations of production, but also in all that follows, that we are absolutely incapable of clearly perceiving these scientific questions and thus advancing the state of our knowledge unless we bring our philosophy directly into play. That is why we affirm for all the historical, theoretical and practical reasons just stated that the time is ripe and that the moment is propitious, at least in our country, for taking critical stock of the state of Marxist-Leninist philosophy, demonstrating its revolutionary nature, refining certain aspects of it, and putting it to work, without delay on various scientific problems, some of which have a direct bearing on the class struggle today. 1. The time is ripe because we need to take stock of things and are capable of taking stock of things. We have learned a great many new things since Marx and Engels and even since Lenin's Materialism and Empirio-Criticism. Today, we have at our disposal the extraordinary experiences of the Soviet Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, the lessons offered by the various forms of the construction of socialism and their diverse results, the lessons of all the working class struggles against the capitalist bourgeoisie, and all the popular mass struggles as well, the struggle against fascism, the liberation movements of the Third World countries, the Vietnamese people's victorious struggle against French and then American imperialism, the struggle of black Americans, student revolts, and so on. We have not only the experience of the great victories of the workers' movement at our disposal, we also have that of its defeats and crises. Lenin told us 20 times over that when we succeed in thoroughly analyzing the causes of a failure in order to draw its lessons, it always has more to teach us than a victory, since its consequences force us to go to the bottom of things. This holds a fortiori for a serious crisis. When we consider the lessons that Marx drew from the initiatives of the popular masses under the Commune and from an analysis of the reasons for its failure, or the lessons that Lenin drew from the popular masses invention of the Soviets during the 1905 revolution and the failure of this dress rehearsal, we can only say, what about us? What lessons are we to draw from all the unprecedented experiences, all the defeats, failures and victories we now have at our disposal, and from the crisis we are living through? Can all this stupendous experience leave philosophy indifferent? Should it not, rather, guide, nourish and enrich the revolutionary philosophy that the Marxist workers' movement has handed down to us? 2. We also think that the moment is propitious for taking stock of the present state of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. The moment is propitious because it is urgent to invest or reinvest Marxist-Leninist philosophy with all its revolutionary force, so that it can fulfill its ideological and political function as a revolutionary weapon, in the crisis that we are currently living through, as at other times. For the crisis we are living through should not be allowed to mask another that is infinitely more important. Let there be no mistake, we need only become aware of the unprecedented crisis into which imperialism, beleaguered by its contradictions and its victims and assailed by the people, has now plunged, in order to conclude that it will not survive it. We are entering an age that will see the triumph of socialism across the globe. We need only take note of the irresistible course of popular struggles in order to conclude that in a relatively near future, despite all the possible twists and turns, a very serious crisis of the international communist movement included, the revolution is already on the agenda. 100 years from now, perhaps only 50 years from now, the face of the world will have changed, the revolution will have carried the day from one end of the earth to the other. That is why it is urgent to provide all those who are finding their way to communism, and more people are, especially among young men and women in the factories, the fields and the schools, with the means they need to arm themselves with Marxist-Leninist theory and the experience of the class struggle. The philosophy of Marxism-Leninism is one of these means, for it is a revolutionary philosophy, it is the only revolutionary philosophy. To put it very simply, taking stock of the current state of Marxist-Leninist philosophy means understanding clearly, and as profoundly as possible, what this philosophy is, how it produces its effects, and how it must be utilized so as to serve, in Marx's phrase, not to interpret the world, but to change it. Taking stock of the current state of Marxist-Leninist philosophy also means recalling, in order to explain and understand that philosophy, the basic acquisitions of the new science founded by Marx, historical materialism, without which Marxist-Leninist philosophy would not exist. Again, it means recalling that if Marx had not adopted a proletarian, dialectical materialist class position in philosophy, the science that he founded, historical materialism, would not exist. It follows that we have to put this philosophy to work, in order to refine and advance the state of our knowledge in Marxist science, so that we can more lucidly analyze the current concrete situation. To make our expose clearer, let us indicate the structure of what follows. To grasp the sense in which Marxist-Leninist philosophy is revolutionary, we have to know what distinguishes it from earlier philosophies. In order to be able to make this distinction, we have first to know what philosophy in general is. Hence the order of our questions. First question, what is philosophy? Second question, what is Marxist-Leninist philosophy? It appears at a glance that it is imperative to ask these two questions in the order just indicated. Yet they do not define structure of our study. Why not? because, as we shall see in a moment, it is impossible to answer the second question, what is Marxist-Leninist philosophy? Underscore without making a very long detour, that is, without proceeding by way of an exposition of the basic results of the Marxist science of history, of which historical materialism is the general theory. As a matter of fact, contrary to what all philosophers, including many Marxist philosophers, spontaneously think, the question what is philosophy does not fall under the jurisdiction of philosophy, even Marxist-Leninist philosophy. If it did, this would mean that it is philosophy's task to define philosophy. This is what philosophy has taught and done throughout its past history, constantly, with a few rare exceptions. This is what makes it fundamentally idealist, for to maintain that it is, in the last instance, the duty and right of philosophy and philosophy alone to define itself is to assume that it can know itself, that it is self-knowledge, that is, absolute knowledge, whether it uses this term overtly as Hegel does or practices the concept shamefacedly, without saying so, as all philosophy did before Hegel, with a few rare exceptions. Thus it is no wonder that, if we want to propose definition of philosophy that does not merely repeat philosophy's purely subjective, hence idealist, hence non-scientific self-consciousness, but, rather, comprises objective knowledge of philosophy, we have to turn to something other than philosophy itself, namely, the theoretical principles of the science or sciences capable of providing us with the scientific knowledge of philosophy in general that we are looking for. As will appear, we shall have to refine some of these principles and advance the state of our knowledge in some cases, to the extent that we have the means to do so. As will appear, that science and the other sciences deriving from it all depend on the unprecedented discovery thanks to which Marx opened up a new continent, the continent of history, to scientific knowledge. The general theory of this scientific discovery is known as historical materialism. That is why we shall have to make a long detour through the scientific results we need, produced by historical materialism, in order to reach our goal, a scientific definition of philosophy. In the last analysis, this long detour will explain the structure of our study. Here, in the order in which they occur, are the chapter titles. Chapter 1, What is Philosophy? Chapter 2, What is a Mode of Production? Chapter 3, The Reproduction of the Conditions of Production. Chapter 4, Base and Superstructure. Chapter 5, Law. Chapter 6, The State and its Apparatuses. Chapter 7, The Political and Associative Ideological State Apparatuses. Chapter 8, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production. Chapter 9, The Reproduction of the Relations of Production and Revolution. Chapter 10, Law as an Ideological State Apparatus. Chapter 11, Ideology in General. I wish to warn readers from the outset, solemnly, as it were, in order to avoid all misunderstanding, all confusion, and all unfounded criticism, that the order of exposition I have adopted has a serious disadvantage, one no other order of exposition can overcome. It is that the present volume proposes to discuss, above all, the mode of functioning of the superstructure, the state apparatuses as reproduction of the relations of production. It is, however, impossible to talk about the state, law and ideology without bringing class struggle into play. Proper logic would therefore seem to indicate that I should have adopted the opposite order of exposition, and begun by talking about the class struggle before talking about the state, law and ideology. The latter order of exposition, however, would have run into the same difficulty the other way around, for it is impossible to talk about classes and class struggle without first talking about the state, law and ideology. Thus we are caught in a circle, since we would have to talk about everything at once. The reason is quite simple. In reality, all the things that we would like to discuss go hand in hand, and all depend, albeit in a very precise way, on each other. They pay no mind at all to their complex functioning and the distinctions we must make to understand them. A fortiori, they are oblivious to the order of exposition we have to adopt to explain how they work. Since the essence of what I have to say, to the extent that it involves new theoretical refinements of certain limited points, bears on the superstructure, it is legitimate, because one must choose in any case, to choose the order of exposition that offers as many theoretical and pedagogical advantages as possible. For, as readers will eventually see, we also have reasons of principle for thinking that the order of exposition we have chosen is the right one. The class struggle will therefore constantly come into play after a certain very early point in our analysis. It will do so by way of a whole series of effects that remain unintelligible unless we refer to its reality and presence outside the objects we analyze, but inside them as well. However, as we are unable for good to present a theory of the class struggle beforehand, we shall constantly have to bring its effects into play without first having provided a thorough explanation of their causes. It is the more important to spell this out in that the reality of the class struggle infinitely exceeds the effects of the class struggle that we will encounter in the objects analyzed in Volume L. We state this principle clearly, in advance, so as to forestall criticisms based only on reason. The inevitable one-sidedness of our order of exposition. Had we chosen the other order of exposition, beginning by talking about the class struggle before going on to talk about the state, just as many criticisms could have been raised, but from the other direction. On this point, therefore, we ask readers, not for their indulgence, but, simply, for their understanding. It is materially impossible to discuss everything at the same time if one wants to expound things with a modicum of order and clarity. Two final remarks, we shall endeavor, precisely, to be as clear as possible. We must, however, warn our readers that, so as not to traduce our subject, we shall sometimes have to enter into explanations that are complex and call for sustained attention. This is not our fault. The difficulty of our explanations has to do with the objectively complex nature of philosophy, law, its apparatuses, and ideology. Finally, we ask readers to take the present book for what it is, without asking that it do the impossible for us. It is a simple essay, the beginnings of an investigation. While it is a product not of improvisation but of reflection, it obviously cannot avoid the risks of inadequacy, approximation and, of course, error that all research involves. All that we ask is a certain indulgence for the one who takes these risks. At the same time, however, we ask for the assistance provided by the most severe sort of criticism on condition, of course, that it be real criticism, that is, seriously argued and backed up with evidence, not a simple judgment handed down without reasons to justify it. One last warning, if I may put it that way, nothing of what is advanced here should be taken, on any grounds whatsoever, as single quote ch Bible truth. Marx demanded that his readers think for themselves. That rule holds for all readers, whatever the nature of the text one submits to them. 1. Tn. Elsewhere, Althusser refers to the manuscript as a reproduction of the relations of production. Footnote crossed out in the manuscript, single quote 1 am deliberately using, for the time being, the term Marxist-Leninist philosophy. I shall propose another, more accurate term at the end of the present essay. 3. The present crisis is dominated by two events of crucial importance. 1. The 20th Congress and its consequences, which called aspects of Stalin's politics from the 1930s on into question. And 2. The split in the international communist movement, which called the political line that emerged from the 20th Congress into question. 4. Althusser incorporated into the second draft of his manuscript, the basis for the present edition, the chapter that has here become chapter 7, here become chapter 8, and so on. Chapter 10, here chapter 11, was ultimate. What is philosophy? A common sense philosophy, and philosophy everyone thinks she knows, spontaneously, what philosophy is. Yet philosophy is also supposed to be a mysterious activity that is difficult and beyond the reach of ordinary mortals. How is this contradiction to be explained? Let us look a little more closely at its two terms. Everyone thinks she knows, spontaneously, what philosophy is, on the basis of a conviction that all people are, more or less, philosophers, even when they are not aware of it, like Monsieur Jourdain, who utter prose without being aware of it. This is the thesis defended by the great Italian Marxist theoretician Gramsci. Everyone is a philosopher. And Gramsci provides interesting details. He observes that, in everyday language, the expression to take things philosophically designates an attitude that itself involves a certain conception of philosophy, bound up with the idea of rational necessity. Someone who, confronted with a painful occurrence, takes things philosophically, is someone who takes a step back, gets the better of her immediate reaction, and conducts herself in a rational way. She understands the event affecting her and acknowledges its necessity. Of course, says Gramsci, there can be a streak of passivity in this attitude. To be a philosopher is to cultivate your own garden, or mind your own business, or see only what suits you. In short, to be a philosopher is also, most of the time, to resign oneself to necessity and withdraw into this resignation, into one's private life, one's inner life, one's day-to-day affairs, while waiting for single quote dust to settle. Gramsci does not deny this. But he insists on the fact that such passivity contains, paradoxically, the acknowledgement of a certain order of things, one that is necessary and comprehensible. At the same time, however, as Plato already notes, we find another idea of what philosophy is in the popular conception of it, an idea embodied in the stock figure of the philosopher who goes around with his head in the clouds or in abstraction and falls down wells. There were no well walls in Greece, as there are today, because he keeps his eyes trained on the heaven of ideas instead of the ground. This caricature, thanks to which that people can make fun of philosophers, is itself ambiguous. On the one hand, it represents an ironic criticism of the philosopher, an affectionate or bitter settling of accounts with philosophy. On the other hand, it contains the acknowledgement of a fact of sorts. Philosophers practice a discipline that is beyond the ken of ordinary men and women, of common people, while being, at the same time, a discipline involving serious risks. Gramsci takes the first term of the contradiction into account, but not the second. But it is not good method to chop things in half and keep only what suits us. We have to take every aspect of the popular conception of philosophy into account. When we do, it appears that, in the everyday expression to take things philosophically, what first meets the eye is resignation to necessity, conceived as something inevitable. One waits for things to settle down, or for the onset of death. To philosophize is to learn how to die, says Plato. The acknowledgement that it is a rational necessity, thus takes a back seat. Indeed, it may be a necessity and nothing else. We may not know the reasons for this necessity, so that is not rational. That is, it may be a fatality. There is no other way. That is usually the case. This remark is crucial. It is crucial, first of all, because it puts the accent on the idea that philosophy, resignation. One cannot say that this equation in fact contains, despite itself, as it were, an idea of philosophy that has critical value. Indeed, we shall be showing that the vast majority of philosophies are forms of resignation or, to be more precise, forms of submission to the ideas of the ruling class, Marx, and thus to class rule. It is crucial, secondly, because it does in fact contain a distinction between two altogether different types of philosophy. There is, on the one hand, the passive, resigned philosophy of those who take things philosophically, while cultivating their gardens, and waiting for the dust to settle. We shall call this philosophy, common sense philosophy. On the other hand, there is the active philosophy of those who submit to the order of the world, because they know it by means of reason, either in order to know it or in order to change it. We shall call this philosophy tout court, writing its name with a capital letter. Take, for example, a Stoic philosopher. He is a philosopher to the extent that he actively adapts to the order of the world, and this rational order is, for him, rational because he knows it through the exercise of reason. Take, for example, the communist philosopher. She is a philosopher to the extent that she militates in order to hasten the advent of socialism, the historical necessity of which she has understood by means of scientific reason. We shall say that all the adepts of Stoicism and all communist militants are, in this respect, philosophers in the second, strong sense of the word. They take things philosophically, if you like. In their case, however, this expression has to do with knowledge of the rational necessity of the course of the world or evolution of history. Of course, there is a big difference between the adept of Stoicism and the communist militant, but, for the moment, it does not interest us. We shall discuss it in due course. What is essential, for the moment, is to see clearly that the common sense philosophy to which the everyday expression refers should not be confused with philosophy in the strong sense, the philosophy elaborated by philosophers, Plato, the Stoics and so on, Marx, Lenin, which may or may not disseminate or, rather, be disseminated among the broad mass of the people. When, today, we encounter philosophical elements in the popular conceptions of the masses, we have to take this dissemination into account. Unless we do, we may mistake philosophical elements in the strong sense that have been inculcated, Lenin, Mao, into the masses as a result of the union of Marxist theory and the workers' movement for spontaneous mass consciousness. Moreover, the popular conception of philosophy, when it ironically shows us the philosopher with his head in the clouds, explicitly recognizes that philosophy can be something altogether different from common sense philosophy. This irony, which is a settling of accounts, indulgent, sardonic, or severe, with speculative philosophy, incapable of concerning itself with down-to-earth problems, also contains its grain of truth, Lenin, namely, that the true philosopher circulates in a world different from that of spontaneous popular consciousness. Let us call it, provisionally, the world of ideas. The philosopher knows and says certain things that ordinary people do not know. He has to negotiate the difficult roads of abstraction in order to attain this lofty knowledge, which is not immediately given to everyone. In this sense, one can no longer say that everyone is spontaneously a philosopher, unless one plays on the sense of the word philosopher, the way Grunstein does unless one confuses common sense philosophy with philosophy tout court. This brings us back to our question, what is philosophy? But, at the same time, we can now see that our first question is pregnant with another, what is common sense philosophy? To answer this two-part question, we shall be developing a certain number of theses in orderly fashion. We will thus be brought to discover a certain number of realities. Only after we have put these realities in place can we come back to our questions and answer them. 11. Philosophy has not always existed. Let us begin with a simple observation. While common sense philosophy has, it seems, always existed, philosophy has not. Everyone knows how Lenin begins his famous book State and Revolution. He points out that the state has not always existed. He adds that the state is observed to exist only in societies in which social classes exist. We shall make a remark of the same sort, but it will be a little more complicated. We shall say that philosophy has not always existed. Philosophy is observed to exist in societies in which 1. Social classes, and therefore the state, exist. 2. Science, or 1. Science, exists. Let us be more precise. By science, we mean, not list of empirical findings, connaissances, which can be quite long, thus the Chaldeans and Egyptians were familiar with a considerable number of technical procedures and mathematical results, but an abstract, ideal, or, rather, idea-dependent, ideic, discipline that proceeds by way of abstractions and demonstrations, for example, the Greek mathematics founded by Althusser, or those designated by this no doubt mythical proper name. To stick with our observation, the facts do indeed appear to show that we are right. We can confirm it in both past and present. It is a fact that philosophy as we know it begins for us with Plato, in the Greece of the 5th century, before our era. We can see that Greek society comprised social classes, our first condition, and that the world's first known science, mathematics, began to exist as a science, our second condition, shortly before the turn of the 5th century. These two realities, social classes and mathematical, demonstrative science, are registered in Plato's philosophy, and combined there. On the pediment of the school in which he taught philosophy, Plato wrote, "Let none enter here who is not a geometer." And he made use of the geometric proportion, which grounded the idea of proportional equality, in other words, inequality, to establish class relations among people that flattered the convictions of the reactionary aristocrat he was. There are people who are made for work, others who are made to command and, finally, still others who are made to ensure that the dominant class has order reigns over slaves and tradesmen. But let us not proceed too quickly. For we can observe another fact as well. Other class societies existed well before 5th century Greece, yet they did not possess the idea of demonstrative science and, plainly, they did not have the idea of philosophy. Examples, Greece itself prior to the 5th century, the great Near Eastern kingdoms, Egypt, and so on. It would clearly seem that, in order for philosophy to exist, the two conditions that we have mentioned must obtain, the necessary condition, the existence of classes, and the sufficient condition, the existence of a science. It will be objected that there were men who called themselves philosophers before Plato, such as the 7 sages, the Ionian philosophers, and so on. We shall reply to this objection a little later. Let us return to the conditions that we have defined and pursue our observations. The unprecedented discipline of philosophy, founded by Plato, did not disappear with his death. It survived him as a discipline, and there have always been people to practice it. It is as if it were necessary that philosophy exist, and not just that it exist, but that it perpetuate itself in singular fashion, as if it were repeating something essential in its very transformations. Why did it continue, and why was it transformed even as it was perpetuated? Let us note that it was continued and developed in what we call the Western world, which was relatively isolated from the rest of the world until the advent of capitalism, a world in which classes and the state have continued to exist and in which the sciences have seen great developments, but in which the class struggle has also seen great transformations. As for philosophy, what has happened to it? We may observe the following. 111 political scientific conjunctions and philosophies. We note that philosophy, too, has seen major transformations. Aristotle is something other than Plato, Stoicism something other than Aristotle, Descartes something other than St. Thomas Aquinas, Kant something other than Descartes, and so on. Did these transformations occur for no reason other than that these great authors were inspired? Or, to put the question another way, why were these authors great authors, whereas a throng of other philosophers, who wrote a host of books, have remained, so to speak, in the shadows, without playing any historical role? Here, too, we can note certain things. We observe, perhaps to our surprise, that all great transformations in philosophy intervene at moments in history either when noteworthy modifications occur in class relations and the state or when major events occur in the history of the sciences, with the additional stipulation that the noteworthy modifications in the class struggle and the major events in the history of the sciences appear, most of the time, to reinforce each other in their encounter in order to produce prominent effects in philosophy. Let us give a few examples. In view of the rudimentary facts we have provided so far, we have to present them in extremely schematic form. We shall modify it later, when we have other analytical principles in hand. As far as most of the great authors of philosophy are concerned, we can indeed observe, in the conjuncture in which they thought and wrote, a conjunction of political and scientific events representing important modifications of the previous conjuncture. Political events, scientific events, author's creation of the idea of a biological science, Aristotle, Macedonian Empire, end of the city-state, creation of the idea of a new physics, the Stoics, slaveholding Roman Empire, Roman law, feudalism plus the first propagation of the Arabs. Scientific discoveries, St. Thomas Aquinas, signs of a revival of Roman law, development of legal mercantile relations under the foundation of mathematical Descartes, physics by Galileo, absolute monarchy, rise of the new foundation of physics by Newton, bourgeoisie, French Revolution, contradictions of the first approaches to a theory of history, Hegel, French Revolution, threat of the fourth estate, eliminated by Thermidor and Napoleon, civil law code, emergence, growth and first struggles, failures and victory of the workers, science of history founded by Marx, Lenin, dialectical materialism, movement, imperialism, rise of the petty bourgeoisie, axiomatization of Husserl, mathematics, mathematical logic, crisis of imperialism, developments in technology, Heidegger and soon. We shall leave it to our readers to breathe life into the elements of the schematic table. We shall restrict ourselves to putting them on the right track with a few simple remarks that are themselves extremely schematic. We shall take just one example, Descartes. The table should be read as follows: Descartes' philosophy, which marks a crucial moment in the history of philosophy, since it inaugurates what we may call modern philosophy, came into existence with the conjunction of important modifications in class relations and the state on the one hand and the history of the sciences on the other. In class relations, we are referring to the development of bourgeois law, which sanctioned, in its turn, the development of commodity relations in the manufacturing period under the absolute monarchy. The absolute monarchy was a new form of state representing a form of transitional state between the feudal and capitalist state. In the history of the sciences, Galileo's foundation of the science of physics, which represents the great scientific event of the modern period, comparable in importance to only two other great discoveries known to us, the discovery that led to the foundation of mathematics in the 5th century and the discovery, due to Marx, that laid the foundations for a science of history in the mid-19th century. Let there be no mistake, we are not claiming that Descartes' philosophy can be deduced from the conjunction of these two decisive events, political, economic and scientific. We contend only that the conjuncture in which Descartes' thought was dominated by this conjunction, which radically distinguishes it from the preceding conjuncture, the one in which, for example, Italian Renaissance philosophers had to think. For the moment, we shall content ourselves with bringing Descartes' philosophy into relation with this conjuncture and this conjunction. What interests us in this conjuncture is this conjunction, which would seem to confirm the validity of the twofold condition that we stated in order to begin to account for what philosophy might be. We shall leave it at that for the moment. Reading the other examples in our table this way, we observe that the transformations of philosophy seem to stand in relation with a complex but unmistakable interplay here between transformations in class relations and their effects, on the one hand, and major events in the history of the sciences on the other. We ask the reader to grant us no more than that. The conditions of existence of philosophy that we have defined are plausible. So much for the past. What about the present? We invoke the present in order to make our definition even more plausible. For we are referring not just to the present of societies in which philosophy exists, but also to that of societies without philosophy. For, in our world, there still do exist societies or groupings of people in which philosophy as we know it has never managed to arise. For instance, the so-called primitive societies, traces of which still subsist. These societies have neither social classes nor science, they know nothing of philosophy. For instance, great societies in which we cannot yet isolate what has been brought into them from outside in order to consider, so to speak, what they were before this importation of the sciences and philosophy. We might take the example of 19th century India or China in order to ask ourselves whether these societies which had social classes, even if they were disguised in the form of castes, as in India, but not science, as far as we know, but we may be mistaken, had what we call philosophies in the strict sense. People readily speak of Hindu philosophy and Chinese philosophy. In question here, however, may be theoretical disciplines that have only the external appearances of philosophy, so that it would doubtless be preferable to give them another name. After all, we, too, have a theoretical discipline, theology, which, while plainly theoretical, is not, in principle, a philosophy. Provisionally, we can hypothesize that the question of the nature of so-called Hindu or Chinese philosophy is of the same order as the question of the pre-Platonic Greek philosophies. Later, we shall attempt to answer this question. Here, to sum up, is what we have found so far, setting out from the simple observation that philosophy has not always existed. We have found, empirically, that the existence and transformations of philosophy seem to bear a close relation to the conjunction of important events in class relations and the state, on the one hand, and the history of the sciences on the other. Let there be no confusion about what we have said and what we have not. So far, we have merely observed that there is a relation between these conditions and philosophy. We do not yet know anything about the nature of that relation. To arrive at a clear understanding of it, we shall have to put forward new theses, making a very long detour in the process. As I have indicated, this detour passes by way of an exposé of the scientific results of historical materialism that we need if we are to produce a scientific definition of philosophy. To begin with, it leads us to the question, what is a societile? Once one science, mathematics, exists, we may say that the idea of science taken from it can serve to authorize theoretical constructions, not yet scientific, that are brought to bear on empirical facts. Hence the idea of a biological science that Aristotle's philosophy takes as its authorization. We shall go much further in due course, at the end of our study. What is a mode of production?